I want to start by introducing Eugen Bacon. Eugen M. Bacon is an African-Australian writer and professional editor who holds an MA, MSc, and PhD. A graduate of computer systems, mentally re-engineered into creative writing. She studied at the Maritime campus, less than 2 minutes walk away from the Royal Observatory in London. Her work has been shortlisted, longlisted, and commended in national and international awards, including the Bridport Prize, Copyright Agency Prize, Australian Shadows Award, Ditmore Award, and the NAMO Award for Speculative Fiction by Africans. Eugen's latest releases are Writing Speculative Fiction and Claiming Timo. She plans to release Road to Whoop Whoop and other stories this year in December.
Thank you so much, Nkenna. Yeah, so I actually feel like an imposter here with Christine and Cherie, and it's just amazing. It's almost overwhelming. Would you like me to do my reading first, or would you like to introduce Christine and Cherie first?
I'll have you do your reading and then I'll introduce each one of you.
Thank you. Fantastic. I would like to read you a story from Hadithi and the State of Black Speculative Fiction. It's a collaboration with Milton Davis by Luna Press Publishing. Hadithi means story in Swahili, and the story is The Water's Memory. The red leopard showed on the night of your wedding, when the sun, the earth, and the moon were imperfectly aligned. You moved from the women's laughter, belly deep and wholesome, and drowned by the sound of village drums. Boom, boom, bee, boom, bee, boom, boom, bee. Our son has found a maiden, began a chorus, a nymphet from the lake, the begetter of our offspring. Boom, bee, boom, bee. Drums boomed as bare bellies gleamed with animal fat. A swish of skirts here, a sway of neck there, and the feet, caked with dust, toes tapping their dance in sync to the beat of drums. A sway of soil from the ground formed a cloud that lifted to the horizon, where a yellow moon eyed the world's shadow. Your arms glittered with cowrie shell trinkets, red, green, and yellow. Dancers swaggered to fever pitch, swayed heads hugged tight with feathers. You admired your cousin Achieng, a young free spirit with the biggest sway, her neck of an ostrich, her eyes of a gazelle. You sat under a stringy bark tree with the rest of the young women, all virgins, gleaming with animal fat rubbed on their skin. You sat next to the children. A handful of babies first started to bom-bee, bom-bom-bee, then surrendered to sleep. Mosquitoes, mellowed with blood, swooned to the ground and trembled their feet. Fireflies flickered orange wings and played with a faint-hearted wind. You stretched your legs away from the fire, lowered yourself into a bush near the forest. A pool formed at your feet as your droplets fell. Aroused by wetness, a green snake slithered close to your big toe. Spirit of my fathers, bearer of good charm, you whispered to him. He slithered into tussocks of grass. The bush rustled. Crouching, you parted the leaves and peered at the night. Amber eyes peered back at you from the shrub. A leopard hissed, snarled, and leapt over you. You plunged to the ground and considered for a long time his long, athletic body marked with scarlet rosettes. And you knew at once that you would bear a firstborn daughter who would die first, and then you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eugen. Let's move on to Christine Taylor-Butler.
I quit. I
Christine-
can't read like that. I quit.
No, you'll be amazing, I'm sure. Let me introduce you. Everyone will know why you'll be amazing. Christine Taylor-Butler is the author of more than 80 fiction and nonfiction books for children. See, already amazing. A graduate of MIT, she holds degrees in civil engineering and art and design. Her current project is the speculative sci-fi fantasy, The Lost Tribes. Her educational publishers and clients include Scholastic, Children's Press, Pearson, Heinnemann, Cherry Lake, Lee and Low, Sterling, and her favorite publisher, Move Books. Christine has been a panelist and moderator at World Science Fiction Convention, North American Science Fiction Convention, ConQuest, Boskone, DragonCon, Snake River, and many others. She has spoken at the American Library Association, National Council of Teachers of English, Assembly of Adolescent Literature, and the Missouri Writers Guild. She has also served as a past literary judge for the We Need Diverse Books and the Society of Midland Authors. An amazing, accomplished writer who I know will be a great reader as well. So tell us what you're reading for us, Christine.
Okay, I have this joke about the fact that Trials is not out yet, and it's because I pulled it. So I'm in the witness protection program, but I am going to read a chapter from the much delayed book, which I'm hoping to get out before George R.R. Martin gets his next book out. Okay. This is called Bait, and it takes place in Ghana, and you'll understand the context. Okay, hang on. Under the cover of darkness, the Zenobian team arrived at a massive fortress near an ocean. 6 of the 25 triads had come on the mission led by Karash, Aurelia, and Deneen. Bastet was with them. The fortress was old and deserted. Cannons pointed towards the ocean with piles of iron balls at the ready. The whitewashed walls were fading, but other than that, Ben felt as if they had landed on a tropical island. White sand beaches glowed under a bright full moon. Fishing boats floated in the distance. He could imagine kings and queens living here. If this was training exercise, it was going to be easier than jumping off a cliff or swimming with sharks. The air was fresh and clean. Waves crashed on the shore and pulled back again, making pleasant background noise for the search. "What are we looking for?" Ben asked. Burko gave him a curious look. "Whatever we can find." His words were slow and careful, as if he were sad to be there. From the looks on the faces of the other warriors, Burko was not alone. "Spread out," said Ben's uncle. 4 teams walked in ordinal directions, east, south, west, and north. His uncle's and aunt's teams remained at the center with Bastet. Deneen continued monitoring, keeping track of vital signs. "Come with me," Ben's uncle said. "Stick close to Burko." Ben swiveled around to get his bearings. "What is this place?" "Don't ask," Burko said. "To speak of it only adds to the burden." Goosebumps broke out on Ben's arms, but he did what he was told. The beads of the warriors clicked against their belts, the violet beads a contrast to the white ones that surrounded them. "So Carlos found a portal at Palenque, did he not?" Burko asked. "Yes," Ben said. "It wasn't there, and then all of a sudden it was." Burko nodded. "What was he doing when he found it?" Ben thought hard. He remembered being in the tomb of the Red Queen. Cerise had dropped her glove in the sarcophagus and couldn't find it. She and Carlos made a joke about Mr. Spock and Star Trek. When all things are considered, whatever remains is the truth. That's what he'd said, and he laughed and took off his glove. "He reached into the sarcophagus," Ben said, "and when he did it with his gloves on, there was nothing there. When he took his glove off, there was a portal. Like a portal in the Sunny Slope Museum. We were able to climb down." Ben's uncle nodded. "All teams, gloves off." "We're looking for a portal?" Ben asked, hopeful that he would finally get to do something positive. "Perhaps, perhaps not," Aurelia answered. "At Islas Ballestas, you found a rod hidden in a cave we assumed had no clues at all. It activated the terraformers on Rapa Nui. So we do not know what we will find, only that your presence here will help us find it." Ben's heart lifted. Okay, let's get this party started. Not here, Nzinga transmitted privately. Never say that here. Why? Ben asked, using telepathy. The Zinga remained quiet, but the expression on her face was pain. Ben realized the fortress must hold a sacred space, and he'd respect that. After searching the grounds, the team reassembled. Karash led them down into the dungeons. Thick arched openings led to an even darker room, some with only one single window. Moonlight streamed past iron bars, casting their shadows on the wall. Bars meant to keep someone in or keep something out. Solemnly, the triads walked from one room to another. Ben touched the walls as ordered. They all did, with Bastet in panther mode, hunting and sniffing as they went. Finding nothing, the cat retraced his steps, then took up position in the rear. He seemed tense, as if he were hunting something a lot larger than a mouse. The beads on the warriors' belts glowed in the darkness, making it impossible for Ben to lose sight of them. Someone, mostly Burko, was always at his side as they walked. Ben stopped at the third dungeon. Do you hear that? Burko shook his head. What is it you hear? Karash asked. I can't tell, Ben said. The sound is faint. It sounded like crying, pain. He jerked his hand away from the wall. This is a prison? It was, Aurelia said, but those who were held here now rest with the ancestors. Nothing remains beyond painful memories. Ben wasn't so sure about that, but he kept walking, the sounds growing stronger until he reached a wooden door with a skull and crossbones above it. The warriors bowed their heads in prayer. You may remain outside if you so wish, Karash said. Burko can remain with you while we search. I want to go, Ben said, pretty sure he was lying to himself. I'll go with them. Karash nodded his approval. Proceed. Once inside, the dank and dark place overwhelmed him. The team's bead became almost white hot and cast a glow in the room. The center beads took on a reddish glow. Ben supposed that was from the heat. Who was bad enough to be put in here, Ben asked. People who didn't deserve it. Deneen's skin was a dusky color now. We'll discuss that at a later time. As they searched the small space, looking for a portal that didn't appear, Ben kicked something metal with his foot. It clanged and rattled. He looked down, but the rough stone floor was bare. What did he kick? Young warrior, are you experiencing pain? Burko asked, touching his shoulder. Save yourself. Ben froze in place. You can't hear them? I do not. Burko looked startled. You heard sounds on the yacht as well. Can you explain further? Ben touched the wall. The boat wasn't like this. The singing was, he caught blurry flashes of images. This was a prison. Bodies were crammed in here. No food, no water, people dying, memories of being outside. The voices grew louder until they became shouts. There was pleading, the sounds of waves. He looked around. Was it sound effects? Was this a museum? The warrior's beads now glowed red. A chorus of voices slammed into Ben's head. Run! Dizzy, Ben kneeled and put his head between his knees. I can't get the voices out of my head. So many languages, not all the same. There's an opening in the wall, hundreds of bodies going through it. Out to the beach, fresh air, boats waiting. Fear. Do you see an artifact? His uncle asked. Through the door, no return. No one ever returns, Ben said, battling the nausea. He breathed heavily and lifted his head. Bastet went into battle mode as the room began to spin. The warriors, all of them, pulled their knives from their sheaths as the walls began to budge. Something was coming out of them. Test the countermeasures, his uncle ordered. Ben tried to focus. No place to run. He'd seen something before when Kavera, he couldn't remember. He felt sick, so sick. A terrible smell overwhelmed him. Were there corpse flowers here in the dark? Something wet flowed under his hand. Confused, he pulled his hand up and saw nothing but dust. Countermeasures working, Jemadari. Ben felt a sharp prick in his arm. Deneen, quickly. You have the required readings? His uncle asked. Yes, Karash. Analysis complete. Come home. Ben heard a woman's voice say. He'd heard that voice before back in his neighborhood. Transport him back now, Ben's uncle shouted. Aurelia put her hands on his face and forced him to look at her. Ben, we are one. We are family. One heart. Return to balance, she whispered. His sickness faded as an electric charge ran through his temple. Then something else, images of something flooded into his brain. His home planet, his uncle in the temple, someone nearby, and an evil presence defeated, a Jacaravite knife on the floor. Run! A woman's voice screamed in his head. Ben stared into Aurelia's eyes and saw them grow wide in alarm. He tried to turn to see what startled her, but she held him firm in her grasp, pressed her palm hard against his forehead, and whispered, "Forget." A transport beam took hold of him, and then blackness.
Wow, what a captivating story. What a great excerpt to read. And last but not least, let me introduce Cherie. Cherie Renee Thomas is an award-winning fiction writer, poet, and editor. Her work is inspired by myth and folklore, natural science, and the Mississippi Delta. Nine Bar Brews, Stories from the Ancient Future, released May 2020, is her fiction debut. She's also the author of two multi-genre hybrid collections, Sleeping Under the Tree of Life and Shotgun Lullabies. She edited the World Fantasy-winning, groundbreaking Black speculative fiction anthologies, Dark Matter, and is the first to introduce W.E.B. Du Bois' science fiction and short stories. Her work is widely anthologized and appears in the Big Book of Modern Fantasy, edited by Anne and Jeff Vandermeer. She is the associate editor of the historic Black Arts Literary Journal, Obsidian. She was recently honored with the 2020 World Fantasy World Award finalist in the Special Award Professional category for contributions to the genre. I'm really happy to have you here, Cherie, and read a passage as well from your work. What have you chosen for us?
Thank you. I'm going to read from a short story called Ancestries, and it's in 9 Bar Blues. In the beginning were the ancestors, gods of earth who breathed the air and walked in flesh. The backs were straight and the temples tall. We carved the ancestors from the scented wood before the fire and the poisoned water took them too. We rubbed ebony-stained oil on their braided hair and placed them on the altars with the first harvest, the nuts and the fresh fruit. None would eat before the ancestors were fed, for it was through their blood and toil we emerged from the dark sea to be. But that was then, and this is now, and we are another tale. It begins, as all stories must, with an ending. My story begins when my world ended, the day my sister shoved me into the ancestors' altar. That morning, one Sunday before Oma Day, my bare heels slipped in bright gold and orange paste. Circadia blossoms lay flattened, their juicy red centers already drying on the ground. The air in my lungs disappeared. Struggling to breathe, I pressed my palm over the spoiled flowers as if I could hide the damage. Before Yura could smile and cover it, the younger children, they came for me. Fela, Fela, they cried and backed away. The ancient ones will claim you. Their voices were filled with derision, but their eyes held something else, something close to fear. Claim her? Yura threw back her head, the fishtail braid snaking down the hollow of her back, a dark, slick ill. She is not worthy, she said to the children, and turned her eyes on them. They scattered like chickens. Shrill laughter made the Circadia plants dance. A dark witness, the fat purple vines and shoots twisted and undulated above me. I bowed my head. Even the plants took part in my shame. And I don't need you, shadow, my sister Yura said, turning to me, her face a brighter, crooked reflection of my own. You are just a spare. Only a few breaths older than me, Yura, my twin, has hated me since before our birth. Our Oma says, even in the womb, my sister fought me, that our mother's labors were so long because Yura held me fast, her tiny fingers clasped around my throat as if to stop my breath. I had yet to take. The origin of her disdain is a mystery, a blessing unrevealed. All I know is that when I was born, Yura gave me a kick before she was pushed out of our mother's womb, a kick so strong it left an impression, a mark like a bright shining star in the middle of my chest. This star, the symbol of my mother's love and my sister's hate, is another way my story ended. I am told that I refused to follow, that I lay inside my mother after her water spilled, after my sister abandoned me, gasping like a small fish, gasping for breath. That in her delirium, my mother sang to me, calling, begging me to make the journey on into life, that she made promises to the old gods, to the ancestors who once walked our land, to those of the deep, promises that a mother should never, ever make. You were the baby one, head so shiny, slick like a ripe green pea, our Oma would say. Right, Yura echoed, her voice sweet for Oma, sweet as the circadia's tree's fruit, but her mouth was crooked, slanting at me. Yura had as many faces as the ancestors that once walked our land, but none she hated more than mine. While I slept, Yura took the spines our Oma collected from the proper fish and sharpened them, pushed the spines deep into the star in my chest. I waked to scream, but the paralysis would take hold of me, and I would lie in my pallet, seeing, knowing, feeling, but unable to fight back or defend. When we were Larda, and I had done something to displease my sister, rise, awake, breathe, talk, stand, Yura would dig her nails into my right shoulder and hiss in my ear, shadow, spare, thief of life, you are the reason why we have no mother. It was my sister's favorite way to steal my joy. And then when she saw my face cloud as the sky before rain, she would take me into her arms and stroke me. There, my sister, my second, my own broken one, she would coo. When I descend, you can have mother's comb and put it in your own hair. Remember me, she would whisper in my ear, her breath soft and warm as any lover's. Remember me. And then she would stick her tongue inside my ear and pinch me until I screamed. Our Oma, she tried to protect me, but her loyalty was like the Sawa wind, inconstant, mercurial. Oma only saw what she wanted. Older age and even older love made her forget the rest. Come, I could hear the drumbeat echo of her clapping hands. Yera, Fela, she sang, her tongue adding more syllables to our names. Yera, Bella, the words for one and two. The high pitch meant it was time to braid Oma's hair. The multivosal loops meant she wanted the complex spiral patterns. 3 hours of hard labor if my hands did not cramp first, maybe less if Yura was feeling industrious. With our Oma calling us back home, I wiped my palms on the inside of my thighs and ignored the stares. My sister did not reach back to help me. A crowd had gathered, pointing but silent. No words were needed here. The lines in their faces said it all. I trudged behind my sister, Yura's tall, straight back, my eyes focused on the fishtail's tip. They should have buried you with the afterbirth, she said. Thank you.
Wow, thank you all so much for reading passages from your work. That was amazing and captivating. So next thing I want to do was just give you some general questions, so open to all three of you to answer. The first being a very kind of general, obvious one, which is what drew you to fantasy writing or any of the kind of categories that fall under or around fantasy writing, like speculative fiction, sci-fi, Afrofuturism. What kind of made you gravitate towards that genre of literature?
Thank you, Kenna. I can start.
Yeah.
Thank you. So fantasy is precisely that. It's fantastical. It's out of the ordinary. It's visionary. It's imaginative. You can write alternate history, as was discussed in a previous panel. You can write fairy tale or folklore. You can write origin story like Ngugi wa Thiong'o's The Perfect Nine, where he writes the story of Gikuyu and Mubi, the origins of the clans of the Gikuyu people. And so for me, I think of fantasy as an escape. You can explore your imagination. I can explore my curiosity about myself, curiosity about my world. I can write about Black people. I can write Black people's stories. I can look at all the possibilities. It's just, it's a very safe place where you can explore your stories.
Excellent response.
Oh, we can't hear you.
Muted.
Oh,
All right. I think that's exactly right. You know what? I grew up in inner city Cleveland, but I grew up in an intact family, and you know, we lived with my grandparents while my dad was going to college, and so we didn't have a lot of money, but we were close to libraries. You know, that was really stressed. And you know, I grew up in the 60s where, you know, there were limitations on what Black people were allowed to do. and you know, so fantastical things weren't taught in schools. You know, my teachers were trying to be practical, but we were a big Lost in Space, you know, Star Trek family, you know, just, you know, horribly big. So my reading material when it wasn't assigned in class was sci-fi and fantasy, because I could escape and imagine myself on another planet. And you know, I'm lucky enough to have grown up and married a nerdy guy that's exactly the same way.
Yeah, for me, fantasy was just a natural progression of the experience I already had living as a Black person on the planet. As Caldwell Eshun said, it is like the Middle Passage is what the first, for us, like a contact story, an alien contact, first contact story. And then when you're in your own environment, your own community, sometimes you walk around and you are treated as if you are alien, as if you don't belong. So for a child with a great imagination, which all children really have, the field of the imagination is a natural place to spend time and play in that sandbox and make clover crowns in the fields. For me, I feel like I was imprinted by the oral storytelling of my grandparents, who wanted to impart not only the biographical information of their actual heart journey from Mississippi or from Fayette County, Tennessee, into what was our home, Memphis, but also the stories that they shared of their imagination, the Hank tales and the scary ghost tales that they would tell us, and also the true history as well. My dad was in the Air Force, so we traveled and ended up on a base because they didn't have enough room for us on the Air Force base. We ended up at the Army base in White Sands, New Mexico. And some of my earliest memories, of course, driving back and forth in White Sands, New Mexico, where they tested the first atom bomb out there, changed all that desert into pure white sand, gigantic ants and roly-polies and tarantulas and every other kind of thing you can think of. And also just walking past these huge replicas of rockets. My dad worked, you know, he was a mechanic. He repaired the jets and all those things. And so we would go to air shows. And so I was always thinking of how the sky seemed to have no limit for me. It seemed to have, I would try to contemplate what was beyond it. And I just feel like all those things conspired to make me a speculative fiction writer.
Oh, that's amazing. So it sounds like not only imagination, but tradition and history go into writing good speculative fiction. How about, let's say, book learning and what you learned in school? Because I know that, Eugen, you have a degree in STEM, so do you, Christine, and Sari. You wrote about dark matter and dark matter. And in the Memphis Magazine latest publication of your work, it talks about you considering at some time chemistry as a career path. So how much of the book learning that you did in and out or in school kind of contributes to the way that you've written your speculative fiction and fantasy?
Oh, it's all in there. You know, I was an MIT interviewer. So in the evenings, my volunteer gig, and I was meeting all these 12th graders who wanted to get into, you know, schools like MIT, and they only knew how to regurgitate an answer, and they you know, they didn't understand exploration and failure. And you know, here I am working as a manager at Hallmark, and I'd always wanted to be a writer. But you know, my kids, as they were growing up, you have books like Harry Potter, and if I say Expelliarmus, it's not really going to work. I've been trying that on Congress for years. It just does not work. But I thought, you know, I wanted to write a book in which we explored some of the real science. You know, I wanted to be, you know, science fiction and fantasy, but, you know, if you're going to talk about something, there's so many weird mysteries like Palenque, where it looks like, you know, Pakal is really in a spaceship, you know, the emperor that was down there, the king. So MIT kind of outed me this year, because they figured out if I go to that castle, I actually have the real GPS location for that. And, you know, if they go to Atlantis, I have a scene where, you know, one of the characters is just a little brat, he's a little bratty, and she insults one of the warriors, and he turns into this dragon and pitches her into a field of seaweed, which then gets up and carries her off to Atlantis. And my editor said, "What is that?" And I said, "Oh, there is a scientist at UC Berkeley who discovered this species of octopi that looks like algae. And when it's scared, it puts all its arms up, then it runs on two. So meet the visiting delegation from Atlantis." And I use the real technical terms because if one nerdy kid says, "I wonder if that's a real thing," it probably is. so nothing about my educational background is wasted. It's all kind of like packed into the book.
Yeah, I do agree with you, Christine, because I like to think of art and science as a marriage in the sense that you learn from the one to the other. And my background in IT and the sciences, it gives me good grounding when I'm writing my stories. In a way, it's almost like a bullshit detector, sorry for the language, but you are more credible when you approach your research. You learn your structure, you're organized. You know, you can have a certain skepticism when you look into something. It really just helps you. You have that curiosity, that attention to detail. And I think that aspect of it really helps my creativity. And so the two marry, and then from the creativity comes the aesthetics, the passion, the playfulness, and together they really work. And when you think of what I studied in IT in those days, we're learning about FBOS machines, you know, so technology changes so quickly. So what we learned may not be useful in its current state, but it gives you a good grounding to research.
And for me, my background was history and anthropology. That's what I studied. I studied the power of storytelling, the historiography of our nation and of other nations, the stories we tell ourselves, and actually build societies around those stories we tell. One of the things I learned in doing that kind of historical research is that often the work that is produced is informed by the questions we do not ask. It's informed by the silences. So I became a shrewd reader of, as you, my own bullshit detector, when you began to study a nation's mythology that it creates for themselves. And you look at the primary sources and you realize, wow, there's a whole different perspective here, or there are multiple perspectives. And this is what we've been told was the reason for this action or this war, this activity. But then when you dig down on the ground local level, you find all these other kinds of experiences in the diaries, in the Freedmen's Bank records, in the archives that are hidden of the people who don't often get to tell their own story. So that was one thing that informed me. The labs of chemistry and calculus, they cured me from wanting to have a career in the sciences, because I realized I was not as interested in the activity of the pursuit. I was more interested in the questions and the stories that comes out of the research and that journey. And so I thought, if I've got to study stories, you know, let me study some different ones. And that's why I went into history versus majoring in English, for example, which I never did, because I felt like I didn't read the stories that had the most impact on me. They were not assigned in school. They were not a part of the curriculum. In fact, the curriculum was so dated and so out of touch, I would say, that if you were any child would suffer, I think, but if you were a black child, absolutely you would suffer from lack of self-knowledge. And so for me, I wanted to find the stories of the world. And that was a wonderful way to do that. And also to be able to just do what a writer loves, which is research, dig in those books, go into the deep, dark archives, find the old maps. I felt like Indiana Jones down there.
Yeah. Oh, great. That segues to a question I want to ask, Christine, because you've been talking a lot about representation and not necessarily seeing what you wanted to read or yourself in the books that you were assigned in school. And Christine, I looked at your website, and something that you wrote just really felt profound to me, and I felt it like on a really emotional level. So on the matter of representation, you write, while more books are being published that depict children of color, must show kind of us mired in stereotypes, or they're tailored for what publishers think that we want to like read or think that, you know, rings true to them. And this is what I really like. There's this one sentence that you write, like a familiar accent, I can tell the voice is off right away when you read these books. Okay, so what type of work and research do you do to create diverse, multifaceted characters? For example, you read from The Lost Tribes and your protagonist is Ben, and he has an array of friends who help him with his adventure, along with his uncle Henry. Can you talk a bit more about like your process developing these multifaceted, diverse characters?
Yeah, that was hard. You know, I kind of, you know, I'm really good friends with the woman who writes Wings of Fire, and she says, you know, my editor made me cut down the number of tribes, and I say, yeah, I wish I'd done that too. What I wanted to do, the basis of tribes, is what would happen if the key to saving the universe was locked in the DNA of the most marginalized people living on Earth. You know, and so I intentionally picked kids who are not seen in literature. So Carlos is from, you know, Guatemala, and Grace is from Tibet. And at the time there was a huge issue about, you know, China, you know, trying to control Tibet. And you know, Ben grows up African American, and Cerise is part of the Navajo Nation. So Cerise, for instance, I was a guest on the Navajo reservation for 2 weeks, you know, working with girls, and it blew my mind about what assumptions I had made versus being there and saying, okay, you can't read about it in a book, but in the, you know, in the end, kids are kids. So there are rhythms that inform what they say and what they do because it's a part of their cultural background, and yet there's a commonality to it. So what I tell people, especially when they're writing about Black people, because this is my bone of contention in children's publishing, is not every Black person grew up in Brooklyn, you know, in a brownstone. You know, not every Black person grew up in Compton. That me growing up in Cleveland, Ohio is a different experience as a Black woman or as a Black girl than my cousins who grew up in Compton, you know, or people I knew from New Orleans. And yet I can get on a phone. I know how to code switch so that you can to mask the accent, but I can get on the phone, and if I don't know who's talking, I can still tell. There's a tone and a timbre to the way Black people talk that lets me know, okay, they're in the family. And so I wrote that blog because we were at the mercy of white young editors in New York. And I had a lot of colleagues who were saying, you know what, I don't have the power to say no. I've got this publishing contract, and you know, I'm older and I have more insurance. So I was telling the editors, you put these books out, but by the time you've edited them, they sound like a white woman from Brooklyn. And that's why they can't find their audience. So I wrote that blog that says, be brave enough to be happy, using music videos. Sarah Bareilles Brave and Pharrell Williams Happy, to show here are two songs attempting to do the same thing, and yet one went viral and one did not. And that was because Sarah Bareilles has a very specific beat, and Pharrell Williams has embedded 12 tribal beats in his song, so that everyone listening to that song can find some beat in that song they relate to. And it is not always, I'm sorry, white woman in Brooklyn.
Oh, thanks so much. And I think that segues to what I wanted to ask Eugen about, because you're talking about things that can be defined and like compartmentalized, and things that cannot. And in your latest publication, well, one that's coming out soon, The Road to Whoop Whoop and Other Stories, I've seen that people have described this collection of short stories as something that crosses genres and also refuses to be labeled. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of selecting these stories? So ones that you wrote specifically for this collection, and ones that you previously wrote but wanted to include to make this peaceful whole.
Thank you, Kenna. As mothers, we love all our babies, even the ugly ones. So I loved all my stories, but not all of them made it into the collection. They died a really severe, painful, swift death. So the publisher was quite diligent, and the intention of the collection was to write stories that were almost like opining. Initially, The Road to Whoop Whoop, the original title was Opining, because there were stories that were dirges. There were stories that were about death, somebody dies. And when I wrote the stories, and sent them to the publisher. She liked some, but she didn't like others. And she was actually very diligent. She had a list, like it was like a spreadsheet. There were excellent stories, there were good stories, there were okay stories, and there were no stories. I'm not taking this. So I say to her, I'll write 7 original stories for you, which I added to the collection. And it works easier when you add stories to a collection because you already have the theme. And it's interesting to see how the reception has been to the collection, because some of the stories that the publisher thought were just okay are the ones that reviewers are raving about. And so it just shows that there's a certain subjectivity to writing and a certain subjectivity to the reader as well. And the beauty of a collection is that you can give the reader range, and as a writer you can also explore your range. You can write different kinds of stories. And because my writing is exploratory, my writing is a curiosity, it's a search, it's a question. It explains why sometimes it's hard to classify it into a single genre. I like to believe in the playfulness of language, which is why I love Toni Morrison's work, and which is why I love Roland Barthes, because of the pleasure of the text. And that's why my stories are different. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing, Eugene. And I like how you talked about how you kind of personified your stories, that they had to die a tragic death. And it kind of speaks to this idea of like life and ancestry and futurism as well. And I think that's where I turn to Cherie, because you have your latest collection of short stories, 9 Bar Blues, stories from the ancient future. And I've noticed that ancestry and tradition and folklore are things that pop up in a lot of your work. Can you talk a bit more about the term ancient futures? Because it seems like, wow, these are 2 different things here, but it works, it pairs so well. And also talk about the kind of influence of music in your life and your work.
Okay. For the ancient future concept was one, I was just thinking about this ideal that, especially in terms of Afrofuturism or our corner of the genre, you're constantly trying to imagine yourself beyond a colonial setting, or you're trying to imagine yourself outside of the current paradigms. Walida Imarisha and Adrienne Maree Brown call it visionary fiction, when you can imagine different ways, relationships of the justice system, for example. So we have created a society which no longer has these kinds of private prisons where there's from elementary school, well, when I was teaching, the belief was that if you didn't get the child its basic skills mastered by 3rd grade, then they were on a trajectory, perhaps if they were African American in this country, on to being criminalized. They'll eventually will find themselves in another setting that they might not get out of the cycle. And that was a very known thing in elementary school, curriculum and studying, that you have to catch them up by that age. And so this idea of we're working so hard to try to correct centuries-long injustices, right, in the present. Usually that labor is falling on the people who at least have the power to do the changes, right? The majority of the culture has to make a decision to do that. And you're imagining a place outside of that, but by the time you get to it, that future is already an ancient reality, and you're moving on to a whole nother future. So it's like, even if in our furthest dream, at some point, if humanity continues, that future that we imagine so beautifully, so amazingly, is going to be a relic itself. It's this idea that time is constantly moving. And I was thinking also about Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles, and how in some of the stories, the travelers, they go to Mars, and they're thinking, that they're going to see this great shiny future, and then what they've actually seen are the remains of the ruins of a future culture. So their future, or what we thought was our future, was actually their past, and they're actually almost extinct. And then in others of the stories, we are the ones who are extinct. So an astronaut arrives, and he thinks he's talking to a ghost of Mars, and actually the ghost tells him, you are the ghost. Your world no longer exists. You've only just reached here, but the world that you left is no more. So it's all relevant. And for me, when you're working with short stories, particularly short stories that come to you from different sources of inspiration, there are different timelines for each one. So for me and Nine Bar Blues, some of the stories are science fiction, some of them are fantasy, some of them are genre crossing stories. I have a time traveling Jubilee tale, a story that's set after, right before emancipation. And they use time traveling, a magical book, in order to try to, will themselves into a different future where they are free. And yet every place that they land, it's not quite free. So they are constantly traveling, so how does time move for them? It's this temporal place, and they are the liminal space, these characters. So the stories that are set around the world in different time periods, different musical genres. Music is a great inspiration for me. So it's one of the things that connects all those different narrative threads, looking at one of our greatest forms of expression, music, that can be understood around the world, no matter what language, no matter what your mother tongue is, you can communicate with music, so, yeah.
Oh, wow, definitely true. Yes, yeah, the snap, definitely needed. All right, we have about 9 minutes left, and I want to give the audience opportunity to ask questions. I got one from Sean Fraser, and it's for Cherie. He wants to know if you are interested in doing a Dark Matter story. So there have been two so far, one in 2000 and 2004, I believe. He said that during an NPR interview, you discussed compiling stories from African authors for the third volume.
I'm interested, I'm doing other collections. If it will be called Dark Matter, I don't know. I mean, that's something you got to go ask the 5 publishers in New York, right? That's the whole thing. You got to go through gatekeepers, right? So that's a whole nother process. And also when I was doing that, we weren't in the place that we're in right now, right? And I'm in a space of learning. So all I know is that the African writers that I was aware of, they weren't doing as much speculative fiction because partially they didn't feel like they could get through the gatekeepers with that. So people are writing on the continent of Africa. And we know Nadia Okorafor, but she's raised in the United States, here in America. I'm speaking of on the continent of Africa. The kinds of works that we're able to get off the continent are certain works that, historical works, child soldier stories, things that will win the Heinnemann Prize, the Kane Prize. All those have a particular aesthetic, we'll say it like that. And writers are smart. We know. I know not to send my hoodoo magical whatever to unnamed publication of the genre, right?
Okay.
That's still trying to reproduce the golden age of science fiction, so you tailor your writing sometimes to the gates and the doors that you feel like you'll be able to get through. Now we're in a beautiful space, a different space, because honestly, the first collection I hope to do for Dark Matter would have been African science fiction, more African science fiction. I just didn't have that reach to get all those people. No, actually the writing that I was getting from Africa were from white South Africans, which is a whole nother thing, whole nother conversation. So for me, we're in a place where Africans are able and are publishing their own volumes of work that speaks to their realities where they are on the continent and in the diaspora, right? And that is a powerful thing. So I'm in a space of watching and learning, still, doing my own editorial work as well, but I'm in a listening mode, if that makes sense,
Yeah,
Just to add
definitely
on
does.
to that,
Okay.
I think Black writing has really hit a sort of different trajectory at the moment. Movies like Black Panther, which are not necessarily the best Black story, but they open the visibility. So all the stories that were in the underground are suddenly becoming visible, and people are becoming curious about Afrofuturistic stories, about Black speculative fiction, and that's a good thing. And I think small presses also help. So if you don't make it through to the major publishing houses and the gatekeepers, you have small presses that are open to a different kind of story, and that's really working for Black writers.
Yeah, I'm doing a conversation on November 6th for Obsidian Literature and Arts in the African Diaspora, which I'm associate editor for, with several small presses, indie Black presses, to talk about the wonderful contributions they're making in the genre right now. So it is very important, thank you, to say how the power of small presses. I'm thinking about so many Black women in fantasy we're talking about today. Many of them are published by Aqueduct Press in Seattle. Andrea Hairston, myself, Celeste Rita Baker, Lisa Bradley, I believe, just enough. Kiini Abura Salon our publication started at this small press in Seattle, you know. And, you know, so that's the important thing, to be able to navigate the gatekeeping so that the work that you want to see in the world is out there. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, a lot of people in children's publishing knew my publisher, Eileen Robinson, because she was editorial director at Scholastic, and helped an awful lot of people get their start. But she was listening to a lot of concerns I had about children's publishing, and she was seeing it even in her own job. And then her son, you know, she's raising this incredible Black son, and he's not finding literature for himself. So she quit to start Move Books. And, you know, she's been in the music industry, and she's been in publishing for decades. But larger publishers couldn't figure out how she was putting out the quality of books, down to the quality of paper and the illustrators that she was able to get. So she's small and plucky. I tell people I have been published by Scholastic a lot. I'm published by Move Books, which is small. And there is a difference between can't afford and won't afford. And a lot of us are getting more support from indie publishers and smaller publishers than we are getting for the ones that have millions of dollars in the bank account. And so I will tell you, there are a lot of people going, oh my God, I want to be published by Random House. Random House editor is the person who suggested I write Tribes. Then I could not get it through Random House because the editor, who was fascinated and captivated by it, didn't know I was Black until she met me at a conference, having told my agent, God, I can't wait to meet Christine. This thing is fantastic. And you could see the change in the look in her face. So Move Books is a small indie publisher that does not publish just Black authors. But you get a lot of attention, a lot of hands-on attention. So I tell people, don't just look at the big five. Go out and look at the ones who are in it to win it. They deserve your support, but they also support their authors in a completely different way.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've all answered Julana's question about, is publishing getting easier or harder, less or more words. But do you have anything else to say about that?
I just wanted to say there is a deluge of Black women's young adult fiction coming out in the next 3 years. So many works are coming out now. And the only thing I have to say about that, it's a wonderful thing, but the fact that they're all coming out at the same time just reminds us that they could have been coming out all along. All of these writers didn't just sit down one day and decide we're all going to write our novel and have it done at the same time and pitch it at the same time and have it published at the same time. There's things had to burn up. That's what I'm just going to be frank. Things had to burn down. Minneapolis had to be set on fire. Philadelphia is on fire right now. If we want to look back in our past, we have told a story, a lie to ourselves about how the Voting Rights Act even got written, right? We like to say that people marched and they believed and they cared. Well, very minority of people marched. Most of the people were spitting and sicking dogs on people. And actually, Dr. King had died and it hadn't been done. They didn't even sign it when he died. They signed it when the cities were on fire. They signed it when the cities went on fire. And that's when Johnson, a known racist, decided, okay, I'm going to have to sign this legislation, you know, and that's when those things happen. It didn't come in the way that we think. So just to be frank about it, a lot of these people who are suddenly concerned about Black Lives Mattering in publishing, well, we've been saying that for 20 years. We've been literally saying it for 20 years. We've been saying it for 20 years. And it's been the same kinds of people. Some of them are still there. Others have, moved on or been, retired or been pushed out at, a certain point when they have to pay them a certain more money. And then they're, they go put them out and hire, promote their assistants or what have you. So that's publishing. But the reality is all this talent around the world has been here all along. And there's now this desperation in the middle of this pandemic. They need Black content every single where. People that I've known them for 20 years and they never said 3 words to me. And now I'm their best friends. I'm just gonna be real about it. So when we're talking about this industry, we need to tell the truth. Good work is always being written, good work is always being published, but the structures remain the same. And we aren't the ones that are always going to be in the seat. We're not in the rooms often. We're not at the table to make the decisions, to make the changes, the structural changes that need to be made. So I'm hoping that after all of the controversy that just happened with the World Fantasy Convention this year, which I'm enjoying so much, and I told another friend, baby, I'm not going anywhere. They're gonna have to push me out the door of the World Fantasy Convention. I've been fighting 20 years to be in this room and sit at this table. So you better believe I'm not telling people to boycott. I'm telling them, bring your mama, your grandmama, and your sister too. Come. But we're gonna bum rush the gate if we need to. Because I know what happens when you step outside and they say, well, there's not enough in the pipeline. I've seen that in almost every industry I've ever worked in, that excuse. So my whole point is, we've been here, you've been here, we're all here, we love stories, we like to be taken to other places. Open the door, let the gates, open the door, hold the door, hold the door, let us get here. Just that's how I feel about it. Small press, big press, do it. We're here, let's do this. Let it not be another 20 years, let it not be a trend, that passes in and out. We're here doing the good work, as you've heard tonight, these wonderful stories you heard from these amazing writers. So let's just continue to celebrate it, You knew I was going to testify, John.
No, that is an amazing way to end this discussion, this event. There's no better way to leave people with things to think about. Representation and opening up the doors and letting there be a big floodgate of people from different backgrounds and groups being a part of this industry.